June 24th, 1916, 7:20 a.m. German forward observation post, Thiepval sector, Somme Valley, France. Hauptmann Ernst Junger of the 73rd Hanoverian Regiment pressed his hands against his ears as another salvo screamed overhead, the concussion waves rattling the timber supports of his reinforced dugout 30 feet below the surface. He'd been counting detonations for the past 4 hours, a professional habit from his pre-war engineering studies, and the mathematics didn't make sense. The British barrage was firing approximately 3 shells per second per 100-yard sector of front, across a 13-mile bombardment zone that meant roughly 15,000 shells per hour. Junger checked his calculations again, certain he'd made an error. At this rate, the British were expending more ammunition in a single day than German intelligence had estimated they could produce in a week. He wrote in his diary, his hand surprisingly steady. Either the British have discovered limitless munitions, or we have fundamentally misunderstood their industrial capacity. What Junger didn't know, what no German staff officer would understand until the 1918 collapse, was that British industrial mobilization had achieved production scales that violated every assumption of German intelligence calculations. The Somme's preliminary bombardment wasn't depleting British reserves. It represented less than 2 weeks of current production capacity. German planners, relying on pre-war industrial assessments and traditional manufacturing calculations, had estimated British shell production at approximately 100,000 rounds per week. The actual figure for June 1916 was 1.4 million shells per week, a miscalculation of 1,300%. By 1917, British factories would reach 4 million shells weekly, sustained production at levels German economic models considered physically impossible. German military intelligence approached industrial assessment with the same methodical precision that characterized all German staff work. Before the war, the Kriegsakademie devoted significant study to enemy production capacity. Major Friedrich von Bernhardi's 1912 analysis, Britain and the Next War, established the baseline assumptions that would guide German intelligence throughout the conflict. Bernhardi noted Britain's limited standing army, its focus on naval construction, and its traditional reliance on imported manufactured goods. He concluded, Britain's industrial capacity, formidable though it is for peacetime commerce, lacks the organization for sustained military production. Their decentralized manufacturing system cannot achieve the mobilization speeds of German or French arsenals. This assessment reflected sound reasoning based on observable facts. Britain in 1914 maintained only 3 Royal Ordnance factories: Woolwich Arsenal, Royal Arsenal at Enfield, and the Royal Laboratory. German intelligence estimated their combined capacity at 10,000 shells per week, primarily for the Royal Navy. The British Army's pre-war stockpile totaled approximately 500,000 artillery shells of all calibers, adequate for traditional warfare, but, as German planners noted, insufficient for extended continental operations. The Oberste Heeresleitung calculated that British industrial conversion to wartime production would require 18 months minimum, based on the time needed to tool factories, train workers, and establish quality control systems. Captain Walter Nicolai, Chief of German Military Intelligence Section 3B, refined these estimates in his August 1914 assessment. He calculated British shell production potential at 100,000 rounds weekly maximum, assuming full industrial mobilization. This figure derived from 3 factors: Britain's limited number of precision engineering firms capable of producing shell casings to military specifications, the skilled labor shortage in metalworking trades, and the expected disruption of raw material imports by U-boat warfare. Nicolai's report concluded, British industrial capacity, while significant for naval construction, cannot sustain artillery-intensive land warfare beyond 6 months without catastrophic ammunition shortages. The German General Staff accepted these calculations and planned accordingly. What German intelligence failed to anticipate was that British industry operated under fundamentally different principles than German arsenals. German munitions production concentrated in state-controlled factories using traditional artisanal methods, skilled craftsmen producing precision components individually. Britain's industrial base, evolved through a century of commercial manufacturing, emphasized standardization, interchangeable parts, and production line methods. These peacetime commercial advantages, dismissed by German analysts as unsuitable for military precision, would prove devastatingly effective when applied to wartime munitions. The transformation began not in government arsenals, but in the Birmingham workshop of a 58-year-old toolmaker named William Beardmore, 1st Baron Inverness. In September 1914, Beardmore received a War Office contract for 100,000 18-pounder shell casings, a massive order that would have taken Woolwich Arsenal 6 months to complete using traditional methods. Beardmore delivered the entire order in 11 weeks by applying principles he developed: manufacturing, commercial brass fittings, simplified templates, multiple machine operations in sequence, and unskilled workers trained for single repetitive tasks. Each shell casing passed through 19 specialized machines operated by 19 different workers, none requiring more than 3 days' training. The War Office, desperate for shells as the pre-war stockpile evaporated during First Ypres, immediately ordered 500,000 more. The breakthrough that made mass production viable came from an unexpected source: automotive manufacturing. Herbert Austin, founder of Austin Motor Company, approached the War Office in October 1914 with a proposal that seemed impossible. His Longbridge factory, equipped to produce automobile engines, could be converted to shell production within 8 weeks using modified engine lathes and boring machines. The War Office, skeptical but desperate, authorized a trial production run of 10,000 shells. Austin delivered 12,500 shells in 6 weeks, each meeting military specifications, produced by workers who'd been making automobile parts the previous month. The shells cost 60% less than Woolwich Arsenal's artisanal production. The Austin demonstration proved that precision munitions could be manufactured using commercial industrial methods and largely unskilled labor. Within 6 months, the Ministry of Munitions had contracted with 3,894 engineering firms across Britain, from locomotive manufacturers to sewing machine factories. Each received standardized machine tools, templates, and inspection gauges. By July 1915, Britain had converted more industrial capacity to shell production than existed in all German arsenals combined. The technical challenge wasn't merely producing shell casings. The explosion chambers required precision to thousandths of an inch to prevent catastrophic failures. The solution came from American mass production technology. The Ministry of Munitions imported 11,000 precision lathes from American manufacturers: Cincinnati Milling Machine Company, Pratt & Whitney, and Brown & Sharp. These machines, designed for commercial production, incorporated automatic measurements and stops that allowed unskilled operators to produce components to military specifications. A worker with 3 weeks' training could now produce shell casings that previously required a skilled machinist with 5 years' apprenticeship. The explosive filling process underwent similar transformation. Pre-war shell filling occurred at Woolwich Arsenal, where skilled workers hand-poured molten TNT into casings, dangerous work requiring extensive training. Dr. Alfred Maund, later the 1st Baron Melchett, designed Britain's first purpose-built shell-filling factories at Gretna, Scotland, and Queensferry, Wales. The Gretna facility, completed in 14 months, stretched 9 miles, and employed 16,000 workers, predominantly women. Automated conveyor systems moved shells through heating, filling, cooling, and fusing stations. Daily output reached 800 tons of filled shells, more than Woolwich Arsenal's entire monthly production in 1914. By December 1915, British munitions production had achieved scales that violated every assumption in German intelligence assessments. The Ministry of Munitions controlled production at 20,000 factories, employing 3.5 million workers. Weekly shell output reached 400,000 rounds of all calibers, 4 times Nicolai's estimated maximum British capacity. But this represented only the foundation of industrial mobilization. The real transformation occurred during spring 1916 as Britain prepared for the Somme offensive. The production statistics reveal the gap between German calculations and British industrial reality. In January 1915, British factories produced 23,000 shells per week. By July 1915, 180,000 shells weekly. By January 1916, 670,000 shells weekly. By June 1916, 1.4 million shells weekly. German intelligence, even when confronted with captured British ammunition stockpiles, refused to accept these figures as sustainable production rates. They represented them as temporary surges achieved by depleting reserves. The Germans were wrong. The human infrastructure of this production provides context for the scale. By mid-1916, Britain employed 947,000 women in munitions factories, the munitionettes, who operated lathes, boring machines, and shell-filling equipment. At Woolwich Arsenal alone, female workers increased from 125 in 1914 to 28,000 by 1916. The Vickers plant at Barrow in Furness, which employed 3,700 workers producing naval guns in 1914, employed 23,000 workers producing shells, artillery, and small arms by 1916. The Royal Ordnance Factory at Gretna, which didn't exist in 1914, became the largest munitions facility in the world, processing 1,200 tons of gun cotton monthly into 800 tons of cordite propellant. The cost figures illuminate industrial commitment. British munitions expenditure in fiscal 1914 to 1915, £22 million. Fiscal 1915 to 1916, £286 million. Fiscal 1916 to 1917, £573 million. By comparison, the entire British defense budget for 1913 totaled £77 million. Shell production alone consumed economic resources equivalent to Britain's pre-war gross domestic product growth. The Ministry of Munitions budget for 1916 exceeded the total cost of the Boer War. Raw material consumption demonstrated unprecedented industrial appetite. British industry consumed 4.5 million tons of steel for shell casings in 1916, compared to 7.8 million tons total British steel production in 1913. TNT production increased from 2,000 tons annually in 1914 to 186,000 tons in 1916, requiring construction of 14 new chemical plants. Copper consumption for shell driving bands and fuses exceeded peacetime British copper imports by 300%, forcing emergency purchases from American mines and Chilean refineries. The production infrastructure expanded beyond anything German intelligence had anticipated possible. Britain constructed 218 national shell factories between 1915 and 1916, purpose-built facilities employing 500 to 5,000 workers each. The Ministry of Munitions controlled production at 3,894 controlled establishments, private factories operating under government contracts with standardized specifications. This distributed production network, dismissed by German planners as inefficient compared to concentrated arsenals, proved impossible to disrupt through air raids or U-boat blockade. Destroying one factory meant negligible production impact when 3,893 others continued operating. The Somme offensive required artillery preparation on scales without historical precedent. British Fourth Army Commander General Sir Henry Rawlinson, planning the assault, calculated that breakthrough required complete destruction of German defensive positions across a 13-mile front. His artillery plan specified 7 days continuous bombardment, firing 1.5 million shells, more ammunition than Britain had stockpiled at the war's beginning, delivered in 1 week. German intelligence intercepted British preparations through multiple sources. Aerial reconnaissance photographed massive ammunition dumps behind British lines. German listening posts detected increased rail traffic delivering shells to forward dumps. Deserters and prisoners reported unprecedented shell stockpiles in British trenches. Captain Nicolai, analyzing these reports, concluded the British were concentrating their entire ammunition reserve for one massive effort. A desperate gamble that would leave them unable to sustain offensive operations afterward. He calculated the bombardment would exhaust British ammunition production for 3 months minimum. His assessment, distributed to German commanders on June 15th, stated, "British shell expenditure will necessarily be followed by ammunition shortage, rendering them incapable of sustained operations through autumn." The bombardment began at 7:20 a.m. on June 24th, 1916. British artillery batteries, positioned wheel to wheel across the 13-mile front, opened fire simultaneously. The barrage included 1,437 artillery pieces, 427 heavy guns, and howitzers firing shells, weighing 100 to 1,500 pounds. 1,010 field guns, firing 18-pounder and 4.5-inch shells. German defenders, sheltering in dugouts 30 to 40 feet below the surface, experienced sustained concussion beyond anything previously encountered in warfare. Hauptmann Karl von Kleewes, commanding the 180th Regiment, defending Mametz sector, recorded his experience in the regimental war diary, June 24th, 0720 hours. British bombardment commenced unprecedented intensity. Continuous detonations render communication impossible, dugout structure vibrating constantly. Men showing signs of severe psychological distress from sustained concussion, June 25th. Bombardment continuing undiminished, all surface structures destroyed, wire entanglements obliterated. Connection with neighboring positions lost. British shell expenditure suggests they have mobilized ammunition reserves from entire army. June 26th. Bombardment intensity increasing rather than diminishing. This cannot continue. No army possesses such ammunition quantities. But it did continue. For 7 days, British artillery fired an average of 214,000 shells daily. On June 30th, the final day before the infantry assault, British guns fired 250,000 shells in 18 hours. German soldiers, emerging from dugouts after the bombardment lifted on July 1st, found landscapes transformed beyond recognition. Trenches had become continuous crater fields. Woods were reduced to splintered stumps. Villages had been pulverized to brick dust. The ammunition expenditure statistics reveal what German intelligence had failed to grasp about British industrial capacity. The Somme 7-day preliminary bombardment consumed 1.5 million shells of all calibers. An additional 3.5 million shells were fired during the offensive's 141-day duration, bringing total Somme ammunition expenditure to 5 million shells. This represented less than 4 weeks of British production capacity at mid-1916 levels. While German intelligence believed the British were exhausting their reserves, British factories were producing shells faster than Fourth Army could fire them. The Somme bombardment's intensity created tactical problems German defensive doctrine couldn't solve. German trench defensive theory, developed after 1914's trench warfare stabilization, assumed artillery preparation would be limited by attacker ammunition supplies. Defensive positions therefore emphasized deep dugouts for sheltering during bombardment, followed by rapid movement of defenders to parapet positions before attacking infantry arrived. The doctrine assumed bombardments would last hours, perhaps 2 days maximum, before ammunition exhaustion forced the attack. The British barrage shattered these assumptions through sustained 7-day intensity. German defenders, sealed in dugouts under continuous bombardment, suffered psychological collapse from sustained concussion. Medical officers reported artillery psychosis, defenders incapable of functioning after emerging from dugouts, despite physical survival. The 99th Reserve Infantry Regiment, defending Auvillers sector, reported 30% of personnel psychologically unfit for combat duties after the preliminary bombardment, though suffering minimal physical casualties during the bombardment itself. British tactical evolution during the Somme reflected emerging understanding of industrial warfare's possibilities. Early attacks followed pre-bombardment doctrine. Infantry advanced in waves after artillery lifted. By August 1916, British artillery introduced the creeping barrage, a moving wall of shells advancing ahead of infantry at 100 yards per minute. This technique, requiring precise timing and massive shell expenditure, demanded sustained ammunition availability that German planners considered impossible. The 14th Division's attack at Delville Wood on September 3rd employed creeping barrage, firing 50,000 shells in 4 hours, more ammunition than entire British pre-war stockpile. German tactical responses struggled against industrial arithmetic. Counter-battery fire, the traditional method for suppressing enemy artillery, proved futile when British could replace destroyed guns faster than German artillery could destroy them. The 26th Reserve Division, defending Pozières, reported destroying or disabling 33 British artillery pieces during July through counter-battery fire. British Fourth Army records show 67 replacement artillery pieces moved into position during the same period, creating net increase in British artillery strength. The casualty mathematics of industrial firepower appear in German medical records. The 52nd Infantry Division, defending Highwood sector during July, suffered 3,420 casualties in 23 days, 149 daily. Of these, 2,890 resulted from artillery fire, only 530 from small arms or other causes. Artillery inflicted 85% of casualties, fundamentally altering warfare's tactical character. German infantry, trained and equipped for rifle combat, found themselves largely irrelevant against industrial bombardment. German intelligence reassessment of British industrial capacity began during the Somme opening weeks. Captain Nicolai, confronted with evidence of sustained British shell expenditure far exceeding his calculations, requested comprehensive industrial analysis. His revised report, dated August 1916, acknowledged fundamental miscalculation. British munitions production has achieved levels we deemed impossible. They have successfully mobilized commercial industry for military production using mass production methods our arsenals cannot replicate. Current British shell production is estimated at 1.2 million rounds weekly, 12 times our pre-war assessment. This recognition arrived too late to alter German strategy. The Hindenburg Program, announced September 1916, attempted to match British industrial mobilization through expanded German production. Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg ordered munitions production doubled by spring 1917. German arsenals, structured around skilled craftsmen and precision manufacturing, proved incapable of such expansion. Despite maximum effort, German shell production increased from 600,000 weekly in 1916 to only 850,000 weekly by 1917, while British production reached 4 million shells weekly during the same period. The industrial mathematics revealed by post-war analysis demonstrated the scale of German miscalculation. Total British shell production 1914 to 1918, 187 million shells of all calibers. German production, 160 million shells. France produced 290 million shells during the same period. The Central Powers, even with Austrian and Turkish production included, never matched Anglo-French shell output. The war became an industrial attrition contest Germany couldn't win. German military theorist General Erich Ludendorff, in his 1919 memoir, My War Memories, acknowledged the fundamental error. We failed to understand that modern warfare had become industrial production competition. British methods, which we dismissed as unsuitable for military precision, proved devastatingly effective. They converted their entire economy to munitions production while we attempted to wage industrial war with artisanal methods. The mathematics were impossible. Every German shell fired, the British fired 3. Every ton of explosives we produced, the Allies produced 5. We were trying to win a mathematics problem we couldn't solve. British official historian Brigadier General Sir James Edmonds, analyzing the Somme campaign in the British official history, wrote, "The preliminary bombardment demonstrated British industrial mobilization's success. German intelligence, relying on pre-war industrial assessments, failed to anticipate Britain's capacity for mass production munitions. This miscalculation fundamentally shaped German strategy. They believed British offensives would be limited by ammunition shortage. Instead, British artillery fired shells faster than factories produced them, sustaining bombardments German defensive doctrine couldn't survive." The post-war industrial analysis reveals the scope of British transformation. In 1914, Britain employed 127,000 workers in government arsenals producing military equipment. By 1918, 3.5 million workers in munitions industries. In 1914, Britain produced 2,000 artillery shells weekly. By 1918, 4 million shells weekly, a 2,000-fold increase. The capital investment in munitions infrastructure exceeded £500 million, equivalent to building the entire pre-war Royal Navy twice over. The Somme bombardment's significance extended beyond immediate tactical effects. It demonstrated that modern warfare had become industrial production competition, where battlefield results reflected factory capacity rather than tactical doctrine. German military planning, rooted in swift, decisive campaigns leveraging superior training and organization, proved obsolete against opponents who could simply outproduce them. The shell production crisis revealed fundamental differences between German and Anglo-French industrial mobilization. German arsenals, concentrated in state-controlled facilities, employed traditional manufacturing methods requiring skilled craftsmen. Expanding production meant training more craftsmen, a years-long process. British and French industries, built on commercial mass production principles, expanded capacity through distributing contracts across thousands of factories, employing rapidly trained, semi-skilled workers. German industrial structure, efficient for peacetime precision manufacturing, couldn't scale to wartime demands. The recognition that industry determined outcomes appeared in German military assessments throughout 1917 to 1918. Colonel Max Bauer, Ludendorff's artillery specialist, wrote in March 1918, "We face an opponent who can fire 3 shells to every one we fire. They can afford to waste ammunition on harassing fire and area bombardment. We must husband every shell. This is not warfare as we understood it. This is industrial mathematics." Post-war German military studies acknowledged the strategic implications. Major General Wilhelm Groner's 1920 analysis stated, "The Somme demonstrated that Germany had entered a war we were industrially unprepared to fight. Our military planning assumed swift campaigns, decided by tactical superiority. We never considered that opponents would simply outproduce us. British shell expenditure at the Somme exceeded our entire annual production. We were solving tactical problems, while they solved industrial problems. They won the war in factories, not on battlefields." The British perspective appeared in David Lloyd George's war memoirs. The Somme proved that Britain had successfully transformed itself into a munitions power. "We entered the war with a standing army designed for colonial policing and a navy built for blockade. We emerged as an industrial war machine that could sustain artillery battles of unprecedented scale. The Germans never understood how thoroughly we'd mobilized our economy. They kept expecting us to run out of shells. Instead, production increased monthly. By 1918, we were producing more ammunition weekly than we'd stockpiled for the entire war in 1914. The human cost of industrial miscalculation appears in casualty statistics. British casualties on the Somme's first day, 57,470, including 19,240 dead. Total Somme casualties, 420,000 British, 200,000 French, 450,000 German. The offensive gained 7 miles at cost of 1,070,000 casualties, 153,000 casualties per mile. These figures revealed that even overwhelming industrial capacity couldn't solve trench warfare's tactical problems. British artillery fired more shells during the Somme than all combatants fired during the entire Franco-Prussian War, yet failed to achieve decisive breakthrough. Industrial mobilization had transformed warfare without solving its fundamental problems. The Somme's ammunition expenditure established precedent for subsequent offensives. 3rd Ypres in 1917 fired 4.3 million shells in 19 days of preliminary bombardment. The 1918 100 Days Offensive consumed 29 million shells. Each successive offensive required more shells than seemed possible the previous year, yet British industry sustained production. German industry, attempting to match this output, exhausted its labor pool, raw materials, and transportation infrastructure. By September 1918, German shell production had collapsed to 350,000 weekly, less than half 1916 levels, while British production continued at 4 million weekly. The Somme bombardment represents warfare's transformation from tactical art to industrial mathematics. German military excellence, superior training, tactical doctrine, and operational planning proved inadequate against opponents who simply produced more ammunition. Captain Nicolai's 100,000 shells weekly calculation, derived from reasonable pre-war assessments, exemplified the fundamental miscalculation that cost Germany the war. British industrial capacity, dismissed as unsuitable for military precision, achieved production scales that German artisanal arsenal system couldn't match. The broader implications extended beyond ammunition. The same industrial mobilization principles that enabled Britain to produce 187 million shells also produced 4 million rifles, 240,000 machine guns, 170,000 Lewis guns, 52,000 aircraft, and 2,636 tanks. German industry, attempting to match this output while maintaining artillery ammunition production, achieved none of these goals adequately. By 1918, German divisions were equipped with captured British weapons because German factories couldn't supply their own forces. Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich von Bernhardi, whose 1912 analysis established baseline assumptions for German intelligence, wrote in his 1920 retrospective, "I calculated British industrial capacity based on their pre-war military production. I failed to understand they would mobilize their entire commercial industrial base for military purposes. They converted automobile factories to shell production, textile mills to explosive manufacturing, and employed millions of women in work we reserved for skilled craftsmen. Our assessments assumed they would wage war as we understood it. They redefined warfare as industrial production competition. We lost the war in calculations made before it began. The Somme 1.5 million shells in 7 days, fired when German intelligence calculated Britain could produce only 100,000 shells weekly, represented the death of traditional military calculation. Warfare had become mathematics, production rates, consumption rates, industrial capacity, labor mobilization, raw material access, transportation efficiency. Tactical excellence, strategic planning, and military training remained important, but secondary to fundamental question: which side could produce more ammunition? German military planning never recovered from this industrial miscalculation. Every subsequent German offensive attempted to achieve breakthrough before Allied industrial superiority became decisive. The spring 1918 offensives, Germany's final attempt at victory, failed partly because German artillery lacked ammunition for sustained bombardment. German batteries fired preliminary barrages lasting hours before attacking, while British and French batteries responded with days-long counter-bombardments. The mathematics were inescapable. When Hauptmann Ernst Junger emerged from his dugout after 7 days of British bombardment, surveying a landscape transformed into cratered moonscape, he understood something fundamental had changed in warfare's character. He wrote, "We had thought ourselves prepared for modern war. We had studied recent campaigns, developed defensive doctrine, built formidable positions. None of it mattered. The British simply buried us in shells. They fired more ammunition in 1 week than we thought they possessed. This isn't war, as we understood it. This is industrial annihilation." He was right. The Somme bombardment announced that the Great War had become a contest between factories, not armies. Germany, entering the war with confidence in military superiority, discovered too late that industry determined outcomes. British factories, employing methods German arsenals dismissed as unsuitable for military precision, produced ammunition at scales that made traditional military calculation obsolete. Captain Nicolai's 100,000 shells weekly estimate, seemingly reasonable in 1914, proved to be wrong by a factor of 40, a miscalculation that helped lose a war and destroy an empire. The 7 days of thunder on the Somme were the sound of one century's warfare dying and another's being born in fire, steel, and industrial mathematics that no military tradition could overcome.